Hey everybody, welcome. Here we are again with the American Battlefield Trust at Winchester, Virginia. I'm Garry Adelman. We got Andy Poulton behind the camera there. We're going to have a couple more people coming on soon. And standing in Winchester, what do you know about it? Maybe you know that there's a battle here. Maybe you know that there's 2 or even 3 battles here. Maybe you know that it changed hands 1,644 times, or maybe a little bit fewer than that. I think our guests will help me to get that together. But we thought in getting into sort of Shenandoah 160, Winchester, 3rd Battle of Winchester 160, that we could talk about the other battles of Winchester and this one and where we're standing. So let's start this up right away with Jonathan Noyalas, good friend of preservation, professor at Shenandoah University, prolific author, writes about Cool Spring most recently and knows all about this stuff. So come on, man, where are we?
All right, so we're standing right now at Fort Collier. So Fort Collier is it is probably the first earthwork fortification constructed in Winchester during the Civil War. So Winchester was a very strategically vital community because of its proximity to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, Winchester and Potomac Railroad, the paved Valley Pike. And so in July of 1861, Fort Collier, which was a Confederate earthwork fortification, was constructed. But by the end of the Civil War, the entire city of Winchester was completely encircled in a ring of earthwork fortifications. So Fort Collier is most known for its role in the 3rd Battle of Winchester, kind of the culminating moment late on the afternoon of September the 19th, 1864. But prior to that, Union soldiers, Confederate soldiers, they made use of Fort Collier, and also it became, in the early part of the conflict, a tourist attraction. And so, you know, you think about Winchester in 1861, there's not a lot to do here, and so you have an army that's building this earthwork fortification. And so people were coming out to visit this thing. They had never seen anything like this before. Harriet Griffith, who was a Unionist sympathizer from Winchester, came here in August of 1861 to view the fort under construction. And when she went back to her home in Winchester that night, she sat down, she took out her diary, and she started writing about all the really cool, wonderful things she saw here. You know, the heavy artillery, the troops digging and working, construction of the parapets. And then she gets to the end of this diary entry and she really starts to reflect on what this place is intended for. It's not a tourist attraction as it is today, but rather it is a place of war, a place that if it's fought over can bring much death, destruction, and tragedy. And so at the end of that diary entry, she wrote, "It is something to be seen, but I hope it will never be used." So Union soldiers, Confederate soldiers, they use this at various moments in time, encampments, but there is no real significant action that occurs here until the late afternoon of September 19th, 1864, during the 3rd Battle of Winchester.
Thanks, Jonathan. Before we get into the details of the 3rd Battle of Winchester, I'd like to take a little step back on the timeline and acknowledge that there's 3 battles of Winchester. We've got the 1st Battle of Winchester in 1862, the 2nd Battle of Winchester in 1863, and then the 3rd Battle of Winchester in 1864. So in the 1st Battle of Winchester, this takes place on May 25th, 1862, and this is Stonewall Jackson returning to the lower portion of the Shenandoah Valley, and he's going to, in Confederate terms, liberate the city of Winchester from Union control, driving Union General Nathaniel Banks out of the city. So it's one of those high moments in Jackson's 1862 Valley campaign. It is witnessed by many people, including the civilian population, and it really raises Jackson in the minds of the people. It's that one of those morale moments that happens in the Shenandoah Valley and kind of sets this precedence of what Confederate supporting civilians want from their generals in the other years of war in this region. And they're wondering by 1863 if it's going to be possible for the town to be liberated again, because there's been a Union occupier, a Union liberator who's enforced emancipation, and he's in town. And to talk about him, I'm going to bring Jonathan back on, and this will bring us into the 2nd Battle of Winchester.
Thanks, Sarah. So on New Year's Day, 1863, Robert Milroy, commanding about 7,000 Union soldiers, entered Winchester from the west. And the weather that day was extremely warm. It was in the mid-70s, which is obviously very unseasonable for January 1st. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, the sun was burning brightly, and Milroy, who was a very devout Presbyterian at the time, he took this as a sign, as an omen, that God had appointed him to enforce President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in an area that really boasted some important connections to slavery's perpetuation. After all, Winchester was the home of Judge Richard Parker, the man who presided over John Brown's trial, and it was also the home of Senator James Mason, who was the author of the very controversial fugitive slave law that was part of the Compromise of 1850. When Robert Milroy was in Winchester, he did a great deal to strengthen the fortifications north and west of town. He felt that he would be able to withstand an attack by a force of at least 3 times his size. And of course, in mid-June of 1863, as Richard Ewell's corps was leading the way in toward Pennsylvania, Milroy realized that he was off in his estimation. Second Battle of Winchester, which really begins on June the 13th, 1863, south of town. Ultimately, over the course of the next 2 days, it becomes a disastrous defeat for General Robert Milroy. It culminates north of town near Stevenson's Depot on June the 15th, early that morning, where Robert Milroy's command is just simply annihilated. More than 4,400 of his soldiers are captured. Milroy ends up being arrested as a result of this. Now, what 1st Winchester and 2nd Winchester reveal is that there was no single Union force, or Confederate force for that matter, who would be able to protect and defend Winchester. So Winchester was a very indefensible place, hence why we have all of these earthwork fortifications. Nathaniel Banks found this out in '62, Milroy found it out in 1863, and Jubal Early would find this out in 1864.
Ooh, that's a good transition there. Thank you, Jonathan. So as 1864 comes along, U.S. Grant and others are tired of the Confederates using this Shenandoah Valley. So effectively, finally, they assemble a Union force under an energetic commander that you may or may not like, named Phil Sheridan, who is going to have a force of upwards of 40,000 soldiers to confront the 14,000 soldiers or so under Jubal Early. Those aren't good odds. I mean, Confederates have overcome numerical disadvantages before, but this is going to be tough, and this is going to rage from just before noon on September 19th, 1864 through various phases. They fight around Berryville Cannon, they fight in the First Woods, Second Woods, in the Middle Field, in the West Woods, names now associated with the Battle of Third Winchester. Ultimately, the Union will use its strength to occupy and threaten the Confederate left flank. The Southerners fall back, but now here comes a cavalry force so powerful that the Southerners can't stand against it. In fact, if your enemy has more cavalry than you have infantry, probably not a good situation for you. The Southerners are going to break. This site is included with that here at Fort Collier. The Southerners go whirling through Winchester with the Union on their heels, and the Valley Campaign will continue from there. And I want to encourage y'all to watch our other videos. We're going to have a separate video just on the city of Winchester. We're going to have a more detailed video about the Battle of Third Winchester. But before we leave here, I want to bring Jonathan back out in case you wanted to add anything about where we stand or any good Stonewall Jackson stories about him in Winchester.
Thanks, Gary. So, Fort Collier, where we're at right now, this was once about a 350-acre farm owned by Isaac Stein, his wife Catherine, and their 4 children. And I really feel that the Stein family experience sort of represents what a lot of civilians were experiencing and feeling at the Civil War's outset. He was in his mid-40s, and he was an individual who wanted to simply take care of his family and be left alone. And of course, once Confederates under Joseph E. Johnston show up in Winchester in June of 1861, and once the construction of Fort Collier begins, he ends up moving his family from here to a family farm, or he moves in with family members not too far from here at a place called Coe Farm. He stays there until the Second Battle of Winchester, because it sits right beneath Star Fort. And so as artillery shells are whizzing back and forth over this farm, he said, "I'm out of here," ends up spending the rest of the conflict with family somewhat far away from here in Clark County, Virginia. Returns to Winchester after the Civil War, rebuilds the property, and of course the house that stands here was not the home that was here during the Civil War. It was rebuilt after the war by Isaac Stein. And again, I think this place just epitomizes that in a place like Winchester, it changes hands, dozens and dozens of times. The number that's given oftentimes is 72, based on accounts from Julia Chase's diary. Julia Chase, of course, being a Unionist. But there was not a single inch of Winchester that was left untouched by the Civil War.
Thanks, Jonathan. What a fascinating story, and what a reminder about the impact that war has on a region, on the civilian population, and of course on the soldiers fighting here on a battlefield. As we get ready to wrap up our video here, I want to encourage you to continue following along. We'll be releasing more videos that focus on the Shenandoah Valley Autumn Campaign of 1864. Thank you to Jonathan, thank you to Garry, thank you to Andy behind the camera. And I just want to say, yeah, I usually say Winchester changed hands about 70 times. There's so much debate. You'll want to catch our town video and we'll get into a little more detail with that. But depends on which accounts you're reading, and is one of those fascinating details of history that we get to explore.
It's 1400.
And Garry says, of course, it's 1400. I'm going to debate him on that while we walk the streets of Winchester later in our film swing here. But from Fort Collier, thank you for helping to preserve battlefields. Thank you for your support of education to help explain what happened at these places and the stories that impact us to this day.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust's YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.